The year of 1876 breathed a hot, dry promise over the territory, and nowhere was that promise emptier than in the town of Dry Willow. The wind, a constant bully, swept down from the high plains with nothing to stop it. It scoured the paint from the handful of buildings that huddled together along the single-wide street, as if for warmth. It howled a low, mournful tune through the gaps in the warped siding of the general store and whipped dust into every corner of a person's life. Today, it was a particularly relentless gust, carrying a fine red powder that tasted of iron and endings. The dust swirled in a furious dance, momentarily obscuring the bold, black letters on the town's most solid-looking structure, Blackburn Bank. The sign, unlike everything else in Dry Willow, was new. Its paint was glossy, its edges sharp. The wind threw dust at it, and the dust simply fell away, leaving the name pristine and powerful. Riding into the teeth of that wind was Cole Hart. He sat his buckskin gelding with the easy grace of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. The horse, a sturdy animal named Buck, lowered its head against the gale, its mane and tail lashing like whips. Cole's body was a study in sun-faded utility. A sweat-stained hat was pulled low over his eyes, its brim curled from years of sun and rain. His shirt, once a sturdy blue, had been bleached by the relentless sky to the color of a pale horizon. A heavy sack of cornmeal was balanced carefully in front of him, a precious weight against his thighs. He was lean, all hard lines and corded muscle, carved by a life that gave nothing for free. The air around him was an honest testament to his morning's work, the sharp, animal scent of horse sweat, the deep, earthy smell of worn leather from his saddle and reins, and the faint, dusty aroma of the cornmeal itself. He was a part of the landscape, as weathered and unyielding as the rocky outcrops that dotted the plains. His eyes, narrowed against the grit, scanned the street. It was a practiced, quiet observation, the kind that noticed a loose shoe on a horse 50 yards away or the subtle shift in the clouds that might, just might, signal a change in the weather. As he swung Buck in a slow arc toward the general store's hitching post, his gaze fell upon a woman paused on the top step of the boardwalk. This was Eliza Morn. She wasn't a woman who commanded attention with finery or bold gestures, but with a stillness that seemed to defy the wind's assault. She held a large wicker basket filled with folded fabrics, bolts of simple calico and sturdy denim, meant for mending the hard-worn clothes of the town's inhabitants. She was a seamstress by trade, and a hired cook when the need arose, which was often. Her dress was a practical gray, functional and unadorned. Her hair, a deep brown, was pinned up in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Yet the wind had already worked its mischief, pulling loose several fine strands that whipped across her cheek. She clutched the basket tightly, her knuckles white. As she shifted her weight, a subtle wince tightened the corners of her mouth. A deep, ugly bruise, the color of a stormy twilight, bloomed on her shoulder, visible just above the collar of her dress. It was the mark of the town's well, a deep and stubborn hole in the earth that made every bucket of water a battle. She had drawn water for the boarding house before sunrise, and her body still ached with the memory of the rope biting into her flesh, the sheer, dead weight of it. Life was a current, and for a moment, the streams of these 2 solitary lives ran parallel, separated by 20 feet of dusty street. Cole dismounted, his boots landing with a soft thud, and Eliza turned, preparing to descend the steps. And in that instant, chaos erupted from the top of the sloping side street that led to the freight yard. It started with a man's frantic shout, quickly swallowed by the wind. Then came a sound that cut through the gale's howl, the groan of stressed wood and the runaway clatter of heavy wheels on hard-packed earth. A large dray wagon, laden with at least a dozen barrels of kerosene, had broken free from its team. The driver, a portly man in a sweat-soaked shirt, scrambled uselessly after it, his arms flailing. The wagon was a runaway beast, gaining speed with every foot it rolled down the incline, aimed squarely at the center of town, directly in the path of the general store. Panic was a spark on dry tinder. A few women screamed. Men shouted useless instructions. But Cole Hart didn't shout. He moved. There was no thought. only a coiled spring of instinct releasing. He left Buck untethered, knowing the horse would stand, and launched himself off the boardwalk. He covered the distance in 3 long, dust-churning strides, his body low to the ground. He didn't try to stop the wagon head-on. That was a fool's way to get crushed. He angled his approach, running alongside the groaning, bouncing vehicle. With a grunt, he leaped, his calloused hands closing around the heavy wooden tongue of the wagon, the piece that would normally attach to the horses. The shock of the wagon's momentum jolted through his arms and into his spine. Splinters from the rough-hewn timber dug into his palms. He dug the heels of his boots into the street, his body a desperate, living break. The leather soles scraped and tore against the ground, finding little purchase. His shoulder slammed against the front corner of the wagon bed, a brutal impact that sent a shock of white-hot pain through him. He could hear the wood of the wagon frame creaking in protest, could feel the immense, indifferent weight of the barrels wanting to push forward, to crush him, to continue their path of destruction. From the top step of the store, Eliza had seen it all. She, too, acted without conscious thought. Her basket of fabrics tumbled down the steps, its contents spilling and scattering in the wind. Her world narrowed to the runaway wagon and the lone man fighting a losing battle against it. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything, any tool to aid him. Beside the steps lay a stack of loose bricks, left over from a chimney repair. They were heavy, solid. She scrambled down, grabbing one that was shaped like a crude wedge. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight toward the chaos, toward the spinning, iron-rimmed wheel that was taller than she was. She dove low, her gray dress immediately covered in red dust. She shoved the brick against the front of the rolling wheel, trying to force it into the small space between the iron rim and the unyielding ground. The wheel caught it, spit it out. She tried again, grunting with the effort, her bruised shoulder screaming in protest. Cole, seeing her out of the corner of his eye, roared, "Get back!" But she ignored him, her face set with a fierce determination. She jammed the brick in again, and this time it wedged. The wagon lurched, its frame groaning violently. The sudden change in momentum was their undoing. The wagon skewed sideways, and the ground beneath their feet, already loose and dry, gave way. Both Cole and Eliza lost their footing in the same instant. They slipped, a shared slide in the churning dust. Eliza cried out, a small, sharp sound of surprise and fear as she felt herself falling backward. Directly into the path the wagon was now skidding. Her arms flailed, reaching for a hold that wasn't there. In that heart-stopping moment, Cole let go of the wagon tongue with one hand. His body was already off balance, his muscles screaming from the strain, but his reflexes were faster than his pain. He pivoted, his arm lashing out. It snaked around her waist, a band of steel and leather. He pulled her hard against him, her back slamming into his chest. His other hand was still clamped to the wagon, his feet still scrabbling for a hold. He was now trying to stop not only the wagon, but also their combined fall. The world was a blur of motion, a cacophony of groaning wood and scraping stone. Eliza's head was tucked under his chin, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. She could feel the violent shuddering of his muscles, the desperate fight in his body. She was terrified, breathless, the air punched from her lungs by the impact. She felt the wagon lurch one final, terrible time. Her entire sense of balance was gone, surrendered to the strength of the arm that held her. All she knew was that if he let go, she would fall beneath the skidding wheels. "Don't stop," she gasped, the words ragged and torn from her throat. It wasn't a plea of passion, but of pure, primal survival. "Just hold me like that. Again." It was a broken phrase, a desperate command meaning don't you dare let go. Hold on. Keep me from falling. And then, with a final, shuddering groan, the wagon stopped. One of its front wheels had dug itself into a deep rut, and the brick Eliza had wedged was now crushed into the earth beneath it. The beast was slain. For a long second, there was no sound but the lonely howl of the wind and the frantic, syncopated drumming of two hearts beating against each other. Cole's arm was still locked around Eliza's waist. Her hands were pressed flat against his chest, her fingers splayed. He could feel the warmth of her through his thin shirt, the delicate shape of her ribs. She could feel the solid wall of his body, the tremor of exhaustion running through him, the smell of his sweat, of horse and sun-baked dust, filled her senses. It was not unpleasant. It was real. They stood frozen in that embrace. Two strangers fused together by a shared moment of violence and deliverance. The dust began to settle around them, a red curtain slowly falling on their private stage. The spell was broken by a sound from across the street. A low, appreciative whistle cut through the air, followed by a guffaw. From the swinging doors of the saloon, a few grizzled prospectors and off-duty ranch hands had watched the entire spectacle. Now, they saw not two people who had narrowly averted disaster, but a man holding a woman in a tight, public embrace. Their minds, clouded by cheap whiskey, saw only the simple, coarse interpretation. A rumor was born in that moment, as small and insidious as a grain of dust, ready to be carried on the wind to every corner of Dry Willow. The sound shocked Eliza back to awareness. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up her neck. She pushed away from Cole, her hands pressing against his chest to create space. The strength in his arm vanished, and she was suddenly standing on her own, feeling strangely unsteady. She smoothed down her dress, a futile gesture against the grime and disarray. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't meet his eyes. She looked at the stopped wagon, at the scattered fabrics from her basket, at anything but the man who had just held her. Cole simply nodded, his own breathing still ragged. He flexed his fingers, trying to work the feeling back into them. He watched her for a moment as she quickly bent to gather her things, her movements stiff and awkward. He wanted to say something, to ask if she was all right, but the words wouldn't form. Men like Cole Hart spoke with actions, not with phrases. He had acted. That was enough. Eliza, her arms full of dusty fabric, gave him one last, fleeting glance and then turned, almost running up the steps of the general store and disappearing inside. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click. Cole stood alone in the street. The wagon driver was finally catching up, sputtering thanks and apologies. The men at the saloon were turning back to their drinks. The moment was over. He turned and walked back to his horse, his shoulder aching with a deep, throbbing pain. As he reached for Buck's reins, he caught a scent on the wind, a scent that didn't belong to the dust or the horse or the leather. It was faint, clean. He lifted his wrist, the one that had held her waist. Clinging to the sun-browned skin and the leather of his cuff was the simple, unassuming fragrance of lye soap. It was the cheapest soap a woman could buy, the kind used for scrubbing floors and laundry. But on his skin, it was an intimate, lingering ghost of the woman who had fought beside him. And it would stay with him long after the dust had settled. The heat in Dry Willow had teeth. It bit into a man's skin, drew the moisture from his throat, and baked the very life out of the soil. 3 days after the incident with the runaway wagon, the dust had settled, but the tension had not. It clung to the air like the heat itself, thick and suffocating. Cole Hart felt it in the quiet way folks looked at their neighbors, in the deepening cracks in the earth on his family's ranch, and most of all, in the suffocating stillness of Asa Blackburn's office. The bank was the coolest place in town, a fortress of brick and dark wood that seemed to repel the sun. Blackburn sat behind a desk of polished mahogany that was bigger and shinier than any piece of furniture in Cole's own home. He was a man built of soft edges and hard calculations. His suit was a fine, dark wool, absurd in the summer heat, yet he showed not a single bead of sweat. He smiled, a thin, dry expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Cole," he began, his voice as smooth as a worn river stone. "Always a pleasure." He gestured to a leather chair that sighed as Cole sat down. Cole didn't relax into it. He sat on the edge, his hat in his hands, his posture as rigid as a fence post. "Blackburn," Cole answered. The single word was flat, holding no warmth. Blackburn steepled his fingers, the manicured nails a stark contrast to Cole's own, which were permanently rimmed with the dirt of his land. "The quarterly note on your water rights comes due next week." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the setting sun. "The papers are quite clear. The Hart Ranch is the collateral." Cole's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of those papers, though they were locked away in a safe behind the banker. He could feel the ink of his father's signature, and now his own, binding them to this man, to this town, to this parched and unforgiving land. "The calf season was lean," Cole said, his voice low. "The drought." "Ah, the drought." Blackburn interrupted, his tone dripping with a placid, useless sympathy. "A terrible business. It affects us all." He looked out his pristine window at the red dust swirling down the street. It was the look of a man watching a play, not a man living in the same reality as everyone else. Cole thought of his herd. The calves were thin, their ribs showing. The creek that fed their main irrigation ditch had dwindled to a pathetic trickle. He and his younger brother, Ben, spent their days digging, trying to deepen the channel, to coax what little water remained toward their thirsty pastures. Every evening, he would count the coins in the small tin box in the barn. It was a grim ritual. He'd pour them out, the worn silver and copper pieces making a paltry clink on the rough wood. Not enough. It was never enough. "I need an extension," Cole said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Blackburn's smile remained fixed. "An extension," he mused, as if it were a novel concept. "Credit is built on timeliness, Cole, punctuality. It is the very bedrock of commerce." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "The water flows, or the money flows. One of the two must be constant." The threat was as clear as the glass paperweight on his desk. Cole stood up, the leather chair groaning in relief. He placed his hat back on his head, the familiar weight a small comfort. "You'll have your money." "I have no doubt," Blackburn said, leaning back. "One way or another." As Cole stepped out of the bank's cool darkness and back into the sun's glare, he saw Deputy Sheriff Pike leaning against a porch column. Pike was a big man, gone to seed, his uniform perpetually strained at the seams. He had a lazy, watchful quality about him, the kind of man who saw everything and did nothing unless paid to. He nodded at Cole, a barely perceptible motion. Cole didn't nod back. He walked past, the banker's words echoing in his head. One way or another, a few hundred yards away, where the raw, new tracks of the railroad sliced through the edge of town. Eliza Moaned was living her own version of that same desperate calculation. She had taken a job cooking for the grading crew, a rough collection of a dozen men who were leveling the earth for the coming iron rails. The work was brutal, the conditions primitive. Her kitchen was a canvas tent, stiflingly hot, with a cast-iron stove that radiated heat like a second sun. From dawn until well after dusk, she was on her feet, hauling water, peeling potatoes, kneading dough, and scrubbing pots caked with grease and beans. The foreman, a harried man named Miller, had been apologetic. "The company paymasters delayed," he'd explained, avoiding her eyes. "But I can issue you scrip, good as cash at the company store, or I'll redeem it myself the moment the payroll arrives." He'd handed her a few slips of paper, flimsy vouchers with his signature scrawled at the bottom. Eliza had looked at them. They wouldn't pay the rent on her small room at the boarding house. They wouldn't buy thread from the general store. They were a promise, and she had learned long ago that promises were the lightest currency of all. But the men had to eat, and she had to work. So she took the scrip and added it to the small, thin stack she kept pressed in a book, a collection of IOUs from a world that was always just a little short on cash. She served the midday meal, ladling thick beef stew onto tin plates, her face flushed from the stove's heat. The men ate quickly, silently, their faces caked with dust and sweat. They were too tired for pleasantries. They were just empty spaces to be filled. Eliza worked with a grim efficiency, her mind elsewhere, the memory of the runaway wagon, of the solidness of Cole Hart's arm around her, came back to her at odd moments. It was a disconcerting memory. a spark of chaos in her carefully ordered, carefully contained life. She pushed it away, focusing on the scrape of the ladle, the weight of the plates, the endless cycle of work that kept her from thinking too much. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, Asa Blackburn stepped out onto the bank's boardwalk for a cigar. Deputy Pike, as if summoned by an invisible signal, ambled over. He accepted the cigar Blackburn offered, biting the end off with practiced ease. "Things are getting dry, Asa," Pike said, his voice a low rumble around the unlit cigar. Blackburn struck a match on the sole of his boot and held the flame steady. "Indeed they are, Pike, very dry." He drew on the cigar, the tip glowing red. He exhaled a perfect ring of smoke that the wind immediately snatched and tore apart. "It's a simple equation. A man with a thirsty herd and a dry pasture is a motivated seller." Pike grunted, a sound of understanding. He lit his own cigar from Blackburn's. "Hart was in to see you." "He was," Blackburn confirmed. "A proud family, the Harts. Too proud for their own good. Pride doesn't water cattle." He took another puff, his eyes scanning the street, calculating, assessing. He lowered his voice, though there was no one near enough to hear. "Keep an eye on the main ditch. Make sure there are no unfortunate accidents. We need the water to go where it's most valuable. And whoever runs out of water." He finished, his voice a near whisper. "We'll sell their land cheap." Pike gave a slow, deliberate nod. The smoke from their cigars mingled and was whipped away by the wind. Two gray promises of ruin dissolving into the dusty air. The town's anxiety was given a public face on the notice board outside the small clapboard church. Reverend Michael, a tired man with kind eyes, had posted a carefully worded plea, calling for all citizens to conserve and share water for the good of the community. A small crowd would gather before it throughout the day. They would read the notice, their lips moving silently, and then they would turn away, their shoulders slumped. They were good people, but they were thirsty people. A rancher might shake his head, thinking of his own dying pasture. A mother might pull her child close, thinking of the single barrel of clean drinking water she had, and how long it needed to last. There was no water to share. The well of community spirit was running as low as the town creek. It was at the well that Eliza saw Cole Hart again. The sun was low, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The day's heat was finally beginning to recede, but the air was still and heavy. The well was the town's heart and its greatest tyrant. A line of people waited, buckets in hand. The pulley shrieked its monotonous complaint with every turn of the handle. Eliza was near the back of the line, her own 2 buckets at her feet. Cole was several people ahead of her. He wasn't there for his ranch. The town well was for household use. He was likely getting water for his small cabin. He worked the handle with a steady, powerful rhythm, his back and shoulders moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. When it was her turn, her own bruised shoulder ached in anticipation. As she stepped forward, she reached into the pocket of her apron. "Mr. Hart," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He turned. His eyes, in the fading light, were a startlingly clear gray. He looked tired. There were new lines of strain around his mouth. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a small, folded square of cloth. It had been red once, but was now faded and coated in a fine layer of dust that she hadn't been able to completely wash out. "You dropped this the other day." He looked down at the handkerchief in her hand, then back at her face. He seemed to search for a flicker of mockery, of the saloon-born gossip she had surely heard. He found none. He took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second. It was a spark of warmth in the cooling air. "Thank you, ma'am." He started to turn away, but paused. His gaze fell to her shoulder, where the edge of the bruise was still visible. He didn't stare, but his glance was direct, observant. "Does your arm pain you?" he asked, his voice quiet, meant only for her. The question caught her off guard. It was a simple, direct inquiry, a small acknowledgement of her reality. No one else had asked. In a town where everyone's struggles were on public display, Most people found it easier to look away. She shook her head, a small, dismissive gesture. "It's just tired," she said. And then the truth of it, a truth deeper than the bruised muscle, spilled out of her. "The worst thing," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she looked out at the endless, darkening plains, "is being tired alone." The words hung in the air between them, honest and heavy. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He simply met her gaze and held it, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of recognition, the silent understanding of a fellow traveler on a long and weary road. In that moment, a low rumble echoed from the horizon, distant thunder. Everyone in line looked up, a collective, desperate hope rippling through them. A bank of dark clouds was massing in the west, but even as they watched, the clouds seemed to drift southward, their promise of rain carried away on an indifferent wind, heading toward some other, luckier land. A collective sigh went through the small crowd. The hope died as quickly as it had been born. Just then, a small group of children, released from their evening chores, burst out from between the buildings. They ran chasing each other down the street, their high-pitched laughter cutting through the twilight. They were oblivious to the drought, to the mortgages, to the quiet desperation of their parents. They were simply alive, their small bodies full of a boundless energy that the landscape couldn't crush. Eliza watched them, her expression unreadable. A shadow passed over her face, a deep and profound sorrow that seemed to well up from a place she kept hidden from the world. She followed the laughing children with her eyes until they disappeared into the growing darkness. And as she turned back to the well, she drew in a slow, quiet breath, as if swallowing a sigh that was too heavy to release. The past is a scar. For some, it is a faint, silvery line, a story told so often it has lost its power to wound. For Cole Hart, it was a puckered, angry ridge of tissue along his left side, just above his hip. He felt it every time he swung a saddle onto his horse, every time he twisted to mend a fence. In the quiet of the barn, with the scent of hay and old leather filling the air, he'd sometimes stop, his hand drifting to the spot under his shirt. He'd press his fingers against the toughened skin, and the memory would return, not as a story, but as a series of sharp, brutal images. The flash of it was always the same, the shriek of splintering timber, a sound louder and more final than a gunshot, the cloud of hay dust and debris exploding outward as the main support beam of the old barn gave way. His younger brother Ben's face, white with shock, a split second before the roof collapsed. Cole had been on the far side of the corral, his back turned for no more than a minute, mending a broken latch. 1 minute. He had labeled himself with the shame of it ever since the one who arrives late. He had arrived too late to stop the collapse, pulling Ben from the wreckage with a leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He had arrived too late for half the herd, trapped and panicked under the splintered wood. They had sold what was left of those cattle to pay the doctor and to buy the lumber for a new, smaller barn. They sold them at a loss, the beginning of the debt that now coiled around them like a snake, a debt held in the soft, manicured hands of Asa Blackburn. He was late then, and he was late now. Late to save the barn, late to pay the debt, late to see the trap Blackburn was laying for them all. The scar on his side was a constant, physical reminder of a deeper failure, a promise to himself that he would not be late again. Miles away, in a small, stuffy room above the town's boarding house, Eliza Mourne lived with scars of her own. Hers were not on her skin. They were etched onto the quiet hours of the night, after a long day of cooking for the railroad crew, when the smell of grease and boiled coffee still clung to her clothes. She would sit by the light of a single kerosene lamp. She would sew, mending shirts for boarders, hemming a new dress for the blacksmith's wife. The rhythmic pull of the needle through fabric was a comfort, a small point of order in a life that had been thrown into chaos. Tonight, she was mending a tear in one of her own aprons. Her fingers worked automatically, but her mind drifted. The needle paused. She stared at the simple, straight stitches, and they blurred. The memory that came to her was not of violence, but of paper, a single sheet of crisp, white stationery, folded neatly. It had arrived by post 2 years ago. The letter was from the man she was to marry, a respectable merchant's son from back east. Her father had just passed, and his modest dry goods store, her dowry, had been sold to cover his debts. The letter was full of elegant, regretful phrases. He wrote of his own financial misfortunes, of unforeseen circumstances, but the meaning between the lines was as sharp and cold as a winter wind. A bride with no dowry was no bride at all. He had not abandoned her for another woman, but for the lack of a ledger entry. She had learned a hard lesson then. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to depend on the strength of her own back and the skill of her own hands. She had built a wall around her heart, brick by careful brick. But every night, when the mending was done, she would look at the simple wooden chair on the other side of her small table. It was always empty. And in the silence of her room, with the wind rattling the window pane, the empty chair made her back feel cold, as if a door had been left open to a long, lonely winter. The same wind that rattled Eliza's window carried secrets through the dark alleys of Dry Willow. Deputy Pike met Asa Blackburn behind the livery stable, a place of deep shadows and the lingering smell of manure. The meeting was brief, the words clipped. "The ditch is flowing slower," Pike said, not looking at the banker. He studied the moon as if it held some great interest. "Slower is not stopped," Blackburn replied, his voice a silken threat in the darkness. He took a thick envelope from his inner coat pocket. The paper was heavy, important. "A bonus," he said, holding it out, "for ensuring that the public water remains a public trickle, while my own private sluice gate, of course, experiences improved flow." Pike's hand shot out and took the envelope. It disappeared into his own pocket without a sound. It was a practiced, furtive movement. "There's talk," Pike rumbled. "Folks are getting nervous. Hart's been watching the waterline like a hawk." "Let him watch," Blackburn said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A hawk can't make water appear from a dry creek bed. Make sure the main gate is obstructed, a bit of mud, a few fallen rocks. Make it look like nature, an act of God." He smiled his thin, bloodless smile in the dark. "God and I, we have an understanding." He turned and walked away, his polished boots making no sound in the soft dust. The law in Dry Willow had just been purchased, a quiet transaction in the dark. Cole Hart was indeed watching. The next morning, he stood where the community irrigation ditch diverted into the smaller channel that fed his land. He had known the flow of this water since he was a boy. He knew its moods, its pace, its color. And something was wrong. The drought was to blame for the low level. Yes, but this was different. The current was sluggish, weak. It lacked heart. He knelt, plunging his hand into the shallow stream. It felt tired. He walked the line for a mile, his eyes scanning the banks. There was no obvious blockage, no new collapse of earth. Yet the water was dying. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. This didn't feel like an act of God. It felt like the act of a man. That evening, the heat in Eliza's cooking tent was a physical presence. It pressed in from all sides, thick with the smell of boiling potatoes and simmering salt pork. The railroad crew, their faces grim with exhaustion, filed in for their supper. They took their plates and sat on rough benches, eating with the single-minded focus of hungry animals. Eliza was refilling a pot of water when one of the men, a burly fellow named Silas with whiskey on his breath, cornered her near the supply barrels. He was not on Miller's regular crew. He was a drifter, hired on for a few days of heavy work, and his eyes held a mean, restless light. He blocked her path, a wall of sweat-soaked flannel and unwashed grit. "That's a fine stew, girl," he slurred, his voice too loud in the cramped space. He leaned closer, and she could smell the sour odor of his breath. But a man needs more than stew after a long day. Eliza took a half-step back, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of the water pail. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight and even. "The men are waiting for coffee." He laughed, a low, unpleasant sound. He didn't move. Instead, he took another step toward her, closing the small gap she had created. Her back was now against the stacked barrels. There was nowhere else to retreat. "I reckon they can wait," he said, his eyes roaming over her face, her dress. "A pretty thing like you, all alone out here. You sellin' smiles to go with that stew?" He reached out a grimy hand, as if to touch her arm. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hand trembled, sloshing water onto the dirt floor. She could scream, but that might only make it worse. She could see the other men watching, their faces blank, their spoons paused midway to their mouths. They would not interfere. They were too tired, too beaten down by the sun and the work to get involved in another man's business. She was on her own. And then, the tent flap was pushed aside. Cole Hart stood there. He wasn't looking for trouble. He had come to speak with the foreman, Miller, about buying a few old railroad ties to shore up a section of his fence. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Eliza, pressed against the barrels, her face pale with fear. The big, drunk laborer, leaning over her, his hand outstretched. The other men, watching, silent. Cole didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply stepped forward, moving from the entrance of the tent to the space between Silas and Eliza. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't clench his fists. He just stood there, his presence filling the small tent. He was not as large as the other man, but he was as solid and unyielding as a granite boulder. He smelled of dust and horses and clean, righteous anger. Silas froze, his hand hovering in the air. He slowly straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he took Cole's measure. He saw the weathered face, the calloused hands, the utter stillness in the gray eyes that promised a capacity for swift and terrible violence if provoked. He saw a man who was not afraid, who was not tired, and who had clearly decided that this was his business. A long, tense moment passed. The only sound was the bubbling of the stew on the stove. Silas let out a short, contemptuous laugh, but it held no humor. "No harm done," he muttered, taking a step back. He looked from Cole to Eliza and back again. "Just making conversation." He turned and lumbered back to his bench, grabbing his plate and shoveling food into his mouth with an exaggerated aggression. The tension in the tent broke. The other men looked down at their plates and resumed eating. The moment had passed. Cole stood his ground for another second before turning to Eliza. The fear was receding from her eyes, replaced by a profound, trembling relief. Their gazes met over the simmering stew pot. The air was still thick with heat and unspoken words. "Thank you," she whispered. The two words were all she could manage. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "No trouble," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. And then, because that was all there was to say, they both turned away. Cole went to find the foreman. Eliza turned back to the stove, her hand still shaking as she picked up the coffee pot. They moved back into their separate orbits, their separate lives. But something had shifted in the small, hot tent. A connection had been forged in that silent confrontation. They had turned away from each other, but in the quiet, bruised spaces of their hearts, they hadn't. Not entirely. The news came not as a shout, but as a deathly quiet. One moment, the main irrigation ditch that fed the valley was a sluggish but living thing. The next, it was gone. The trickle that reached the Hart Ranch withered and vanished, leaving behind a glistening strip of mud that began to crack and bake in the relentless afternoon sun. The first sign of the real trouble was the sound. It began as a low, mournful complaint from the cattle nearest the empty troughs. By late afternoon, it had grown into a constant, desperate chorus of raw-throated agony. Cole stood on the porch of his small cabin, listening. The sound scraped at his nerves, a physical manifestation of his own rising panic. His herd, the sum of his family's legacy and their only hope for the future, was bellowing for the water he could not give them. Thirst was a cruel master, and it was driving his animals mad. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in his gut, that this was no accident. The ditch hadn't just run dry. It had been choked off. Somewhere upstream, someone had deliberately blocked the flow, and he knew who stood to gain. Nightfall did not bring relief. The air remained hot and still, and the distressed lowing of the cattle echoed under a sky ablaze with cold, distant stars. Cole grabbed a lantern and 2 heavy burlap sacks. His brother Ben, his legs still weak from the barn collapse, was out with the herd, trying to keep them from panicking and injuring themselves. It was up to Cole to find a way, any way, to get water flowing again. His destination was an old wooden bridge a mile upstream, where a narrow, secondary channel split off from the main ditch. The channel was mostly silted up, but if he could clear it, if he could divert even a trickle of whatever water was pooled behind the main blockage, it might be enough to keep the herd alive through the night. As he cut through the edge of town, a figure emerged from the shadows of the railroad cook tent. It was Eliza Moaned. She carried a lantern of her own, its light illuminating the determined set of her jaw. "I heard the talk," she said, her voice low and direct, foregoing any preamble, "about the ditch and the cattle." Cole stopped, surprised to see her. "It's no concern of yours, ma'am." "Thirst is everyone's concern," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "I saw you leave with sacks. You're going to try and clear a channel. You'll need another pair of hands." He looked at her clean but worn dress, her slender frame. This was not a woman's work. It was backbreaking, filthy labor in the dark. "I can manage. You can manage faster with 2, she said simply. She held his gaze, and in the flickering lantern light, he saw the same quiet strength he'd seen at the well, the same resolve he'd seen when she'd thrown herself at the wheel of that runaway wagon. Arguing with her, he realized, would be a waste of precious time. He gave a single, curt nod. "Keep up, then." They walked in silence, 2 small points of light moving through a vast darkness. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the tormented symphony of the cattle fading behind them. The air under the bridge was thick and cool, heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. The main ditch was a wide, muddy scar, the water in it reduced to a few stagnant pools that reflected the lantern light like dead eyes. The secondary channel was choked with years of accumulated silt and debris, packed as hard as clay. But behind a crude, recently constructed dam of rocks and mud that blocked the main ditch, a significant amount of water had pooled. "We moved the sandbags from there," Cole said, pointing with his chin to a pile left by a long-forgotten work crew. "Use them to build a wall, force the water into the small channel." There was no more talk. There was only work. The world shrank to the small circle of light cast by their 2 lanterns, which they hung from low-hanging beams. Cole filled the heavy burlap sacks with thick, wet mud, his muscles straining with the effort. He passed the impossibly heavy bags to Eliza, who stood in the thigh-deep, stagnant water. She dragged them into position, her feet sinking into the sucking mud, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. They worked in a grim, silent rhythm. He dug, she dragged. The mud caked their hands, their clothes, their faces. The cold of the water seeped into their bones. Sweat mingled with the grime on their brows. They were no longer a cowboy and a seamstress. They were 2 desperate people fighting a common enemy, their movements becoming a coordinated, unspoken dance of survival. He learned the rhythm of her breathing, the exact moment to pass her the next sack. She learned the shift in his shoulders that meant he was ready, anticipating the weight before it came. Slowly, painstakingly, a low wall began to form. They used it to channel the pooled water, which began to flow, reluctantly at first, then with more purpose, into the mouth of the narrow channel. It wasn't a river, but it was life, a dark, muddy trickle of hope. They had one last sandbag to place, the key piece that would complete the diversion and send the maximum flow toward the ranch. It was the heaviest one yet. As Eliza wrestled it into position, the pressure of the newly diverted water surged unexpectedly. A powerful current, much stronger than the trickle they had created, swirled around her legs. It was as if a pocket of water had broken free upstream. The muddy bottom, already treacherous, shifted beneath her feet. She cried out, a sharp gasp of surprise as she slipped. Her hands flew out to brace herself, but there was nothing to grab. As she fell backward, The hem of her heavy skirt snagged on a thick, rusty nail protruding from one of the bridge's wooden pilings. She was jerked to a sudden, violent stop. The current pulled at her, but the nail held her fast. She was trapped, her leg twisted at an awkward angle, the cold water rising around her waist. Cole saw it happen in a flash of lantern light. He didn't think. He launched himself through the water. He reached her in 2 powerful strides, just as her head was about to go under. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her upright, his other hand grabbing onto the rough, slimy wood of the piling to anchor them both. The force of his lunge sent them crashing back against a low-hanging support beam. His back took the full impact, the rough, wet timber slamming into him with a sickening thud that drove the air from his lungs. Cold water slapped their faces, and for a heart-stopping second, the world was a black, chaotic roar. His arm was a vice around her, holding her tight against his chest. She was sputtering, gasping for air, her body trembling violently from the cold and the shock. He could feel the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of her heart against his ribs. The current was a living thing, pushing and pulling at them, trying to tear them apart. "Don't stop," she whispered, the words a ragged puff of air against his neck. Her forehead was pressed against the wet, muddy fabric of his shirt. It was the same plea as before, but this time it was born not of a fall, but of a current that wanted to drag her under. "Hold me like that, until I can stand." "I've got you," he grunted, his voice a low rasp. "I won't let go." They stayed like that for a long moment, locked in a desperate embrace against the indifferent pull of the water. He was her anchor, the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to swallow her. Slowly, the initial shock receded, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. "The nail," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm caught." He shifted his weight, holding her with one arm while his other hand went down into the dark water. His fingers found the tough fabric of her skirt, pulled taut, and then the cold, unyielding iron of the nail. It was driven deep into the wood. "Pull against me," he commanded. Gently. They worked as one. She leaned away from the piling, creating a small amount of slack, while he worked his fingers between the fabric and the wood, trying to pry it loose. A splinter dug deep into his palm. He ignored it. The fabric was thick, stubbornly caught. "It won't come," he said through gritted teeth. "It'll have to tear." She nodded against his chest, with his hand still protecting her leg from the sharp point of the nail. He gave a sharp, powerful tug. The sound of ripping fabric was loud in the enclosed space. She was free, but the final sandbag still needed to be moved. Without a word, still holding her steady with one arm, he reached down with his free hand, found the sack, and with a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, shoved it into place. The effect was instantaneous. The water, now fully blocked from its old path, surged into the narrow channel with a gurgling roar. It was the sound of a parched throat finally taking a drink. The sound of survival. As they stood there, catching their breath in the sudden quiet, a shadow moved on the bank above them. A man, who had clearly been watching, was startled by their success. He turned to leave. In the moonlight that filtered through the planks of the bridge, Cole caught a clear glimpse of his silhouette. It was the unmistakable shape of a wide-brimmed hat, the kind favored by one man in Dry Willow, the kind worn by Deputy Sheriff Pike. The figure scrambled away into the darkness. A moment later, they heard the sound of a horse, spurred into a frantic gallop, its hoofbeats fading rapidly into the night. Then, there was only silence. The silence of the vast, empty plains, the gentle murmur of the newly flowing water, and the sound of their 2 sets of lungs, fighting for air. The adrenaline began to fade, and the cold set in, a deep and penetrating chill. Eliza was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Cole led her out of the water and onto the muddy bank. He sat her down, then took off his own faded, dusty handkerchief, the one she had returned to him. It was still mostly dry. Without a word, he gently draped it over her shoulders. It was a small, inadequate gesture against the profound cold, but it was all he had to offer. She looked up at him, her face pale in the lantern light, her eyes wide and dark. The sky above them was clear, a black velvet canvas dusted with stars. There was no promise of rain, but there, in the cold and the mud, beneath the old wooden bridge, something had shifted between them. As Cole looked down at the woman who had fought beside him, who had trusted him to hold her against the current, he felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. It was a single, potent drop of something he couldn't name, and it was warmer than any summer rain. The morning after their struggle under the bridge was unnaturally still. The pale, unforgiving light of dawn revealed a landscape bleached of color and life. The trickle of water Cole and Eliza had fought for was still flowing, a thin, dark ribbon of salvation. But it was not enough. Cole knew it was a temporary fix, a single breath stolen from a suffocating hold, driven by a cold anger. He had returned to the bridge at first light, leaving Eliza to the exhausted sleep she so desperately needed. He went not to work, but to see. He knelt in the mud, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind the sudden surge of water, Eliza's cry, the shadow on the bank. He examined the crude dam that had blocked the main channel. It was a clumsy but effective piece of work, a haphazard pile of rocks, mud, and debris. As he pulled at a splintered piece of wood that had been wedged into the bank as an anchor, his fingers found something unnatural. Not the rough, weathered grain of driftwood, but the flat, compressed surface of milled lumber. He worked it free from the mud. It was a small, broken plank, about a foot long, thick with slime. He scraped the muck away with his thumb, and there, burned deep into the wood, were 2 words and a symbol, Blackburn Co. The brand was crude, the letters slightly uneven, the kind used for marking crates and barrels, not for public display. It was a careless mistake, a piece of trash used in a crime, left behind by men who thought no one would ever look this closely. Cole stared at the branded wood, his knuckles white where he gripped it. It was the first solid thing he could hold in his hands, a tangible piece of the conspiracy that was choking the life from his land. It was proof, but it was also a warning. He was no longer just fighting the drought, he was fighting the bank. He found Eliza later that morning, delivering a basket of mended shirts to the general store. The proprietor, a fussy man named Mr. Gable, was measuring out beans behind the counter. Cole waited until he was occupied with another customer, then approached her quietly. He didn't show her the piece of wood. He didn't want to be seen. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low. She turned, her eyes immediately searching his for any sign of trouble. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped slightly, but her gaze was as direct as ever. "What is it? Have you ever delivered any sewing to the bank to Blackburn himself?" She frowned in thought, her mind sifting through the countless small jobs that made up her life. "Yes," she said slowly. "A few months ago, I repaired a set of leather-bound ledgers for him. The stitching on the spines had come undone. Did you go inside past the counter? He had me bring them to the back, to his office. Why?" Cole leaned a fraction closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Think back. Eliza, was there a storeroom? Did you see any crates, any barrels?" Her eyes unfocused for a moment as she traveled back in her memory. He could almost see the scene forming in her mind, the smell of old paper and sealing wax, the heavy silence of a place built to contain money. "Yes," she breathed, her eyes refocusing on his with a sudden spark of recognition. "There was a small storage closet off the main office. The door was open. There were barrels inside, kerosene, I think, stacked high." "Did you see any markings on them?" Cole pressed, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. "A brand," she said, nodding, "burned into the wood. I remember thinking it was a fancy mark for a simple barrel. It said Blackburn Company." Their eyes locked. There it was, the second piece. The barrels of kerosene from the runaway wagon, the storeroom at the bank, the branded plank from the illegal dam. It was all connected, a web of greed with Asa Blackburn sitting at its center like a patient spider. That afternoon, they met in the relative privacy of the livery stable. The air was thick with the smell of hay and horsehide. Using a piece of charcoal on a scrap of brown wrapping paper, Cole sketched a rough map of the valley, marking his ranch, the town, and the winding path of the main irrigation ditch. "Here," he said, his finger tapping the spot where the bridge stood. "This is where we were last night. This is where I found the wood." He made a small X. Eliza leaned over the drawing, her brow furrowed. "The land just north of there, that large parcel that runs along the creek bed, that's Blackburn's, isn't it? The one he bought last year." Cole nodded grimly. He drew a rough outline of Blackburn's property. He then made 2 more X's at different points along the main ditch, further upstream. "Old Man Hemlock and the Miller family," he said, tapping each X in turn. "They've both complained of their water slowing to a trickle in the last month. Both their properties border Blackburn's land." They stood back and looked at the map. The pattern was undeniable. 3 blockages, all strategically placed at points where the ditch ran alongside Asa Blackburn's property. He wasn't just damming the creek. He was methodically cutting off the water to his neighbors, one by one, strangling them into submission. The full scope of it settled over Cole, a crushing weight. This was bigger and more dangerous than he had imagined. Blackburn wasn't just a greedy banker. He was a thief on a grand scale, using the law of the land, the drought, to hide his crimes. Cole's shoulders sagged. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet barn. "To go against Blackburn," he said, his voice heavy with the risk. "He holds the note on my land. He has Pike in his pocket. He could ruin us. Eliza, we could lose everything." He looked at her. His eyes filled with a desperate, hunted expression. He was a man in a trap, and he could feel the walls closing in. Eliza didn't flinch. Her gaze was as steady as a rock. She looked from the map to Cole's face, and her own expression hardened with a resolve that seemed to cut through his fear. "If we don't go against him," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a fierce clarity, "we will lose it all anyway, one mouthful of water at a time." Her words hung in the air, a simple and terrible truth. She was right. To do nothing was to accept a slow, certain death. To fight was to risk a quick and violent one. But it was a risk, a choice. And a choice was more than they had at that moment. A new energy passed between them, a silent agreement. Fear was a luxury they could no longer afford. They decided that night. They would not go to the law, because the law was compromised. They would become their own law. They would watch. They would wait. And they would get the proof they needed. Proof that no one, not even a crooked deputy, could deny. Their preparations were simple and silent. A coil of good rope, a fresh bag of nails from the general store, 2 lanterns, their wicks trimmed, their reservoirs full. They would go to the 3rd choke point on the map, the one nearest the Miller farm, and they would wait. They chose their hiding spot in a thicket of cottonwood trees on a small rise overlooking the ditch. From there, they had a clear view of the water and the banks on either side. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. The night was profoundly silent, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional, distant call of a coyote. They sat with their backs against the rough bark of a tree, not speaking, their senses strained, listening to the darkness. Hours passed. The air grew cold. Cole felt a familiar despair begin to creep in. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe they wouldn't come. Maybe it was all in his head. Then Eliza's hand shot out, her fingers closing around his forearm in a silent, urgent signal. He followed her gaze. 2 figures were moving along the opposite bank. They were shadows detaching themselves from other shadows, moving with a furtive, practiced quiet. They carried heavy sacks on their shoulders. They reached a narrow point in the ditch and began to work, their movements efficient and methodical. One of them opened a sack and began pouring its contents into the water. It wasn't just sand. It was a thick, dark mixture, a sharp, acrid smell, the scent of heated pine resin, drifted across the water to them. The substance was heavier than water. It sank, forming a thick, sticky sludge on the bed of the ditch, designed to clog and choke the flow in a way that would be almost impossible to clear. They were poisoning the waterway. Anger, pure and hot, burned through Cole. He had seen enough. "Now!" he shouted, his voice ripping through the night's silence. He stood up, raising his lantern high. At the same instant, Eliza raised hers. Two brilliant circles of light flooded the scene, catching the two men in a harsh, sudden glare. They were caught completely by surprise. They froze like startled animals, their faces, smudged with dirt and pine tar, turning toward the light. For a heart-stopping second, nobody moved. Then, panic took over. One of the men dropped his sack and scrambled up the bank. The other fumbled at his belt, his hand going for something, a weapon, perhaps, but in his haste, his fingers slipped. There was a small, distinct metallic clink as something heavy fell from his belt and hit a rock. He didn't stop for it. He turned and ran, following his partner into the concealing darkness. They were gone. The sound of their crashing retreat through the underbrush faded, leaving an echoing silence. Cole and Eliza scrambled down the bank and crossed the shallow ditch. The stench of the resin was overpowering. They looked for what the man had dropped. Eliza saw it first, glinting dully in her lantern light. She bent and picked it up. It was a key, not a house key, but a heavy, solid iron key of the sort used for a padlock on a gate or a public utility. It was cold and felt heavy in her palm. Stamped crudely into the metal of the bow was a single, unmistakable letter, a capital P. She held it up so the light caught it. She looked at Cole, her face a pale mask in the lantern's glow. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. Pike. Cole stared at the key in her hand. The initial P, the wide-brimmed hat he'd seen at the bridge. It all clicked into place with the cold, final sound of a jail door slamming shut. He finally understood. The law in Dry Willow wasn't broken. It was bent, curved to fit snugly in the palm of the man with the most silver. And they were holding the key. There was no sunrise, only a slow bleeding of gray into the oppressive black of night. The world was rendered in shades of ash and stone. Cole Hart pushed his horse. Buck, harder than he ever had before. The animal's breath came in ragged, steaming bursts in the cold air, its powerful muscles working rhythmically beneath him. Behind him, Eliza Moaned held on, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her cheek pressed against the solid plane of his back. There was no room for a second horse, no time. There was only the chase. They were following the tracks left by the two men from the ditch, tracks that led away from the valley and into the jagged, wound-like entrance of Red Gap Canyon. The canyon was a treacherous place, a narrow passage carved through towering walls of dark red rock that seemed to lean inward, threatening to crush anything that dared to pass between them. The ground was a treacherous mix of loose rock and sand, and the path twisted like a frightened snake. Every hoofbeat was a gamble. Cole rode with a focused intensity, his body moving as one with the horse. He read the terrain ahead, his eyes narrowed, anticipating every dip and turn. He could feel the tension in Eliza, the way her hands clenched the fabric of his shirt with every lurch and stumble of the horse. He could smell the faint, clean scent of lye soap that still clung to her, a strange and intimate counterpoint to the sharp, wild smell of the canyon and the animal sweat of his horse. Eliza's world had shrunk to the space she occupied, the rough texture of Cole's shirt against her cheek, the solid, unyielding strength of his back, the rhythmic bunching and releasing of his muscles as he guided the horse, the smell of worn leather from his belt, of horse sweat, and a deeper, warmer scent that was uniquely his. She kept her eyes shut against the dizzying blur of the canyon walls rushing past. She listened to the frantic, desperate drumming of Buck's hooves on the rock-strewn ground, a sound that echoed her own heart, which hammered against her ribs with a fearful, driving rhythm. Then came a sound that ripped through the morning's quiet, a loud crack, sharp and violent, followed instantly by the high-pitched whine of a ricochet. It echoed and multiplied off the canyon walls, sounding like a dozen rifles firing at once. Eliza's eyes flew open. High on the cliff face to their right, a puff of rock dust exploded outward, just feet above their heads. A second shot followed, splintering a dead juniper tree on their left. They were being shot at. The men they were chasing had turned to fight. Eliza instinctively ducked lower, pressing her face hard against Cole's back, her arms tightening their grip. He didn't flinch. She felt a deep vibration run through him, not of fear, but of pure, controlled rage. He didn't slow down. He spurred Buck even faster. To stop now, to hesitate, was to die. "Hold on," he shouted over the wind and the echoing gunshots. The canyon path ahead narrowed even further, twisting sharply around a massive boulder. As they rounded the turn, Cole saw what the shooters had been trying to do. They hadn't been trying to hit them. They had been trying to herd them. The path was blocked by a deep, dry ravine, a chasm 10 feet across, cut into the canyon floor by a century of flash floods. It was too wide to cross. They were trapped. On the far side of the ravine, one of the hired hands was reloading his rifle, a triumphant sneer on his face. Cole had a fraction of a second to make a choice: go back into the guns, or go forward into the impossible. He chose the impossible. He wrenched the reins hard to the left, turning Buck away from the path and aiming him directly at a section of the ravine that looked marginally narrower. He dug his heels hard into the horse's flanks. Buck responded with a surge of pure, animal power. The horse, sensing the life-or-death urgency, gathered itself. 3 powerful strides. The world seemed to slow down. Eliza felt the incredible coiling of muscle beneath her, then a sensation of weightlessness as they left the ground. For one terrifying, silent moment, they were airborne, suspended over the rocky chasm. Below her, the jagged rocks of the ravine floor waited. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath held tight in her chest. They landed with a jarring impact that shot up Eliza's spine and knocked the air from her lungs. Buck stumbled, its front legs buckling for a terrifying second. But Cole was already compensating, his weight shifting, pulling the horse's head up, fighting for balance. The horse found its footing and lunged forward, scrambling up the opposite bank in a shower of dust and loose gravel. They were across, but their desperate leap had taken them out of the frying pan and into the fire. Standing in the middle of the path, not 30 yards ahead, was a man on a big bay horse. He was blocking their way completely. He wore a dusty uniform and a silver star that glinted dully in the gray light. Deputy Sheriff Pike. He wasn't running. He was waiting for them, his face a hard, emotionless mask. 2 more men, the ones who had been shooting, were now scrambling to join him. "Go back, Hart." Pike's voice was a low, flat command, devoid of any emotion. "This doesn't concern you." Cole pulled Buck to a halt. The horse stood, sides heaving, its legs trembling from the jump. Cole's hand rested on the worn wooden stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Eliza could feel the tension in his arm, the decision about to be made. It was she who acted first. In her hand, she still clutched the lantern from the night before. It was a dead weight, its fuel spent, but it was a weapon. Her eyes darted to the side of the path, where one of the men, in his haste to join Pike, had dropped the sack he was carrying. A dark, sticky mixture of sand and pine resin had spilled out onto the rocks. With a surge of desperate inspiration, Eliza let go of Cole with one hand, raised the lantern, and threw it with all her strength. It wasn't a long throw, but it was accurate. The glass lantern shattered against the rocks right in the middle of the spilled resin. A few drops of leftover kerosene ignited from the friction of the breaking glass. There was a sudden, violent whoosh. The pine resin, volatile and flammable, erupted in a wall of bright orange flame and thick, black smoke. The fire spread with unnatural speed, a hungry, roaring beast that instantly cut Pike off from his men. The horses screamed in terror, rearing and fighting their riders. Pike's 2 hired hands, their faces lit by the sudden, hellish glare, lost control. One was thrown from his saddle. The other fought his panicking horse, turning it and galloping back the way he had come. The ambush had been broken by a single, desperate act. The fire gave Cole the opening he needed. Before Pike could react, Cole was off his horse and moving. He crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion. He didn't go for Pike's gun. He went for the proof. Pike, caught off guard by the fire and Cole's speed, tried to draw his pistol, but Cole was already on him, tackling him and dragging him from his saddle. They hit the ground hard. Pike was a bigger man, heavier, But Cole was faster and fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He ignored the deputy's flailing fists. His target was the heavy iron padlock and its length of chain hanging from Pike's belt, the symbol of his crime. Cole grabbed for it, his fingers closing around the cold iron. Pike roared and twisted, trying to throw him off. They rolled in the dust, a tangle of limbs and grunts of exertion. Cole got his hand on the chain and ripped it, leather belt and all, from the deputy's waist. The links clattered loudly on the rocks. He had it. But the danger was not over. The man who had been thrown from his horse had recovered. He had his pistol out, and he was taking aim at Cole's back. "Cole!" Eliza screamed. She slid off Buck's back, her legs shaky. She didn't have time to think. She threw herself at Cole, grabbing his arm and pulling him sideways, just as the gunman fired. The gunshot was deafeningly close. A splinter of wood exploded from an old gray mining timber that braced the canyon wall, exactly where Cole had been a second before. A spark flew from the impact, a tiny, angry star in the gloom, and in that instant, everything became clear. The light from the burning resin was now a raging bonfire, casting flickering, dancing shadows all around them. The light fell upon the other dropped sack, the one still intact. The fire illuminated the crude, stenciled letters on its side, making them glow with an infernal light against the coarse burlap. The letters spelled out one word: Blackburn. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the undeniable proof, revealed by the very fire they had started. The brand on the wood, the key in Cole's pocket, and now the name on the sack of poison. It was all there, laid bare in the red dust of the canyon. Pike, struggling to his feet, saw it too. He saw the name, lit by the flames, and the look on his face was one of utter ruin. He was caught. And then another sound reached them, faint at first, but growing clearer, cutting through the crackle of the flames. It was a sound that carried for miles in the clear, high desert air. It was the deep, resonant tolling of a bell, the church bell, back in Dry Willow. It wasn't the slow, steady peal of a Sunday service. It was a frantic, urgent clanging. An alarm. Someone had seen the smoke, heard the gunshots. Someone was calling for help. The whole town, a sleeping giant of fear and frustration, was being shaken awake. The bell rang out, echoing down the narrow canyon, a promise and a threat. Help was coming. But for whom? The sound of the bell trapped them all, Cole and Eliza, with their damning proof, and Deputy Pike, with his stolen authority now burning away like the resin at his feet. The private war in the canyon was over. A public reckoning was about to begin. The church in Dry Willow was not built for judgment. Its pine walls were meant to absorb hymns and prayers, not accusations and lies. Yet, on this day, it was a courtroom. The pews were filled not with the faithful, but with the fearful and the curious, a sea of dusty hats and worried faces. The air, usually thick with the scent of old hymnals and beeswax, was sharp with the acrid smell of burnt resin clinging to the evidence piled on a rough-hewn table before the pulpit. At that table, sitting in the Reverend's high-backed chair, was Judge Thaddeus McCrae, a traveling circuit judge whose arrival in town coincided with the chaos from Red Gap. He was a man with a face like a worn map, etched with the lines of 1,000 difficult decisions, and his eyes, clear and gray, missed nothing. He poked at the evidence with the tip of a letter opener, the charred remains of the burlap sack, the heavy chained padlock Cole had ripped from Pike's belt, the iron key with its incriminating P, and the splintered piece of cratewood bearing the Blackburn Company brand. The collection was a silent, damning testament. On one side stood Cole Hart and Eliza Morn. They were grimy, exhausted, their clothes torn and stained with mud and soot. They stood close together, not touching, but occupying the same small pocket of defiant space. On the other side stood Asa Blackburn, immaculate in his dark suit, looking as cool and unruffled as if he were merely observing a slightly distasteful business transaction. Beside him, Deputy Pike shifted his weight from foot to foot, his face a mottled red, his uniform looking even more ill-fitting without its belt and the authority of the padlock. "A fantastic story," Blackburn said, his voice smooth and untroubled, addressing the judge but projecting for the entire room to hear. He smiled, a thin, patronizing expression, a tale of midnight heroics and imagined conspiracies. But here in the real world, we are governed by facts and contracts, not by campfire stories. He placed a crisp sheaf of papers on the table, setting it down with a neat, final tap. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. This is the Hart family's promissory note. It is a legal document, Judge. It clearly states that payment for their water rights is due today. It says nothing about runaway wagons or phantom saboteurs. He looked directly at Cole, his eyes cold. Whether the water flows or not, the money is still due. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a sound of resignation. They all understood the language of debt. It was a more powerful force than water, more binding than any law. Several ranchers, men who also had loans with Blackburn's bank, lowered their eyes and stared at the floorboards, their own chains suddenly feeling a little tighter. Judge McCrae looked from the contract to Pike. "Deputy," he said, his voice gravelly, "you were found in Red Gap Canyon. There were gunshots. There was a fire. Explain yourself." Pike puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim some shred of his authority. "I was performing my duties, Judge," he blustered, his voice a little too loud. "I received a report of suspicious activity up at the ditch. I went to investigate. To protect the community's water supply." He gestured vaguely toward Cole and Eliza. "They ambushed me. Set that fire themselves, I reckon, to cover their own tracks. They're the ones who've been messing with the ditch." The lie was so blatant, so clumsy, that a wave of disbelieving whispers rippled through the pews. But no one spoke up. To challenge the deputy was to challenge Blackburn, and no one was brave enough, or foolish enough, for that. "The key," the judge said, his voice cutting through the noise. He picked up the heavy iron key, the one with the P stamped on it. "Does it look familiar, Deputy?" Pike paled. "Never seen it before in my life." The judge turned his gaze to Eliza. "Miss Moaned, you were there. Tell me what you saw." All eyes in the church turned to her. She was just a seamstress, a hired cook, a woman with no land, no standing. She stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Cole saw that her knuckles were white, and a fine tremor was running through her fingers. But when she spoke, her voice was low and clear, without a single quaver. It was the voice of a woman who had found something stronger than fear. "We followed the men who were poisoning the ditch. Judge," she began. She recounted the events of the previous night with a simple, devastating clarity. She described the smell of the pine resin, the way the men had moved in the dark. She held up the burned piece of burlap, pointing to the name still visible on its surface. Then, she took the iron key from the judge's table. "And this," she said, her voice dropping, "fell from the belt of one of the men when they ran, one of the men working for him." She looked directly at Pike, whose eyes darted away, unable to meet her gaze. She stood there for a long moment after she finished, the key held in her trembling hand, her testimony hanging in the silent church. She had faced down drunks and foremen, had fought runaway wagons and rising waters, but this was different. She had spoken the truth to power, and the effort had taken every last ounce of her strength. As she turned to step back, the room seemed to tilt, the faces in the pews blurred. A wave of dizziness, born of exhaustion and adrenaline, washed over her. She stumbled, her knees buckling. Cole was moving before she even began to fall. He closed the space between them in a single step, his arms going around her, catching her and pulling her securely against him. She was light in his arms, her body trembling like a leaf. He could feel the desperate, ragged rhythm of her breathing. He held her, his hand spread protectively across her back, his body shielding her from the prying eyes of the town. "Don't stop," he murmured, his voice so low it was meant only for her, a rough whisper against her hair. It was their phrase, the one born of survival, but now it meant something else entirely. "Just let me hold you. Let me be the strong one now. Let me be your anchor." But they were not under a bridge in the dark. They were in a church full of witnesses. Across the room, two women on the back pew exchanged a look. One of them pursed her lips and whispered to her neighbor behind a gloved hand. The words were inaudible, but their meaning was clear. A new rumor, more potent and personal than the first, was taking flight. The whisper of the courthouse embrace began its insidious journey through the pews, twisting an act of support into something scandalous. Judge McCrae cleared his throat, his sharp voice breaking the spell. He had seen the stumble, seen the protective gesture, and had also seen the whispering gossip. He looked at the evidence, then at Blackburn's confident smirk, and then at the faces of the townspeople, divided and afraid. He knew a formal trial here, now, was impossible. He needed time, he needed leverage. "This is a serious accusation," he said, his voice filling the church and silencing the whispers. "And this," he tapped Blackburn's contract, "is a legal obligation. The law must serve both." He stood up, his authority settling over the room like a heavy blanket. "This is my ruling, Deputy Pike. You are suspended from your duties, pending a full investigation by the Territorial Marshal. The main sluice gate at Red Gap will be closed and placed under my personal seal. All secondary and community ditches are to be opened immediately." A collective sigh of relief came from the crowd. "Furthermore," he continued, looking at Blackburn, "I am ordering a 10-day stay on the foreclosure of the Hart property. All debt collection is suspended for that period, to allow this investigation to proceed." Blackburn's smile finally vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. 10 days. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. 10 days, Blackburn said, his voice like chipping ice. He picked up his contract, his property. He looked past the judge, past the evidence, his eyes locking on Cole. "In 10 days, that land will be mine, Hart, with or without water." Cole's jaw was a hard, white line. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He said nothing, his rage a silent, simmering volcano. But Eliza, still leaning against him, found her voice again. She stood a little straighter, turning her head to face the banker. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense air with the sharp edge of steel. 10 days is a long time, Mr. Blackburn, she said, her gaze clear and unwavering. "It's long enough for the truth to flow." The 10 days began not with a bang, but with the weary scrape of a shovel against hard, unforgiving earth. The judge's ruling had granted them a reprieve, a small bubble of time, but it had not granted them water. The community ditches were open, but they were being fed by a creek that was itself dying of thirst. The real water, the lifeblood of the valley, remained trapped behind the sealed sluice gate at Red Gap. Cole knew they couldn't wait for the Territorial Marshal, an unknown man with an unknown agenda. Hope was not a strategy. Work was. On the first morning, Cole and Eliza stood looking at the failed secondary channel they had briefly opened under the bridge. It was too narrow, too choked with silt. To their right was a long, dry depression, an ancient wash where the creek had run a generation ago before changing its course. It was wider, deeper, and aimed like an arrow toward the parched pastures of the valley. "There," Cole said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "If we can clear that, dig it deeper, we can make a new channel, one that will last." It was a monumental task, the work of a dozen men over a dozen days. They were only 2, but they began. Cole drove his shovel into the baked clay, the impact jarring his arms. Eliza worked beside him with a pickaxe, her movements clumsy at first, then finding a rhythm, her bruised shoulder protesting with every swing. The sun climbed, a merciless white eye in a cloudless sky, and the sound of their labor was a lonely, desperate beat in the vast silence. For the first 2 days, they worked alone. The people of Dry Willow watched them from a distance. They saw the 2 figures toiling under the sun, a cowboy and a seamstress, attempting the impossible. They were afraid. Asa Blackburn was a quiet, constant presence in town, his silence more threatening than any shout. He watched from the window of his bank, and his gaze was a weight on the town's shoulders. To help the Harts was to declare oneself an enemy of the bank. The change began on the third day. It started with the blacksmith, a burly man named Peterson whose arms were as thick as fence posts. He walked out to the ditch, carrying 2 sharpened shovel heads. He said nothing. He simply handed one to Cole, took the other, and began to dig. An hour later, 2 ranchers whose land was also suffering, the Miller brothers, arrived with a mule and a plow. Then came others. A few at first, then more. They came with shovels and picks and buckets, their faces set with a grim determination. Fear was a powerful motivator, but thirst, they were discovering, was stronger. A new rhythm took hold of the valley. It was the rhythm of work, the steady thud of pickaxes, the grating shush of shovels, the shouts of men guiding the mule. It was a sound of defiance, a sound that grew louder each day, pushing back against the silence of the bank. The children, freed from their chores, formed a long, snaking line, passing rocks from the new channel hand to hand, their small faces serious with purpose. Mrs. Gable, the saloon owner with a heart tougher and warmer than her whiskey, closed her establishment at noon each day and brought out a huge kettle of hot soup for the workers. Even the Reverend appeared, his face streaked with sweat, carrying a heavy crate of nails and a hammer to brace the new channel's banks with old lumber. Dry Willow was slowly, painfully, remembering how to be a community. The fear of Blackburn hadn't vanished, but it was being crowded out by the shared sweat and purpose of his neighbors. In the midst of this frantic labor, Eliza found a different role. Her hands, not built for the brute force of a shovel, were skilled in other ways. She organized the effort, directing the flow of workers, ensuring everyone had water from the town well. She set up a makeshift kitchen near the worksite, and the smell of her cornbread, baked over an open fire, became the scent of their shared struggle. The children, drawn to her quiet competence, would gather around her during breaks. To keep them occupied, she would draw letters in the dust with a stick. One afternoon, she drew 4 letters, H-O-L-D. "Hold," she said, her voice soft but clear. The children repeated it. It means to keep something safe, to not let go. She looked from the children to the men and women toiling in the ditch. You hold on to a rope so you don't fall. You hold on to a promise. You hold on to each other. And right now, she said, her gaze sweeping over their small, earnest faces, we hold the line. We hold on until the water comes. The word became their mantra, a simple symbol for their complex fight. The days were for work, the nights were for watching, and for a quiet, fragile connection to grow in the darkness. One evening, Cole found Eliza by the corral, tentatively trying to saddle Buck. "He's too tall for me," she admitted, frustration in her voice. "You're going about it all wrong," Cole said, his voice gentle. He didn't take the saddle from her. Instead, he stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, showing her how to place her foot, how to use leverage instead of strength to swing the heavy saddle onto the horse's back. Later, in the moonlight, he led her and the horse to the old wooden bridge. "You need to learn to trust the horse," he said, "to feel its movements." He had her ride across the bridge, again and again. At first, she was rigid with fear, her hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles were white. The horse, sensing her fear, was skittish. "Easy," Cole murmured, his hand on her arm. "Breathe." He walked beside her, his presence a calming influence on both woman and animal. He had her close her eyes, to feel the gentle sway of the horse's gait, the solid strength beneath her. She slowly began to relax. On the last pass, he told her to let go of the horn and hold on to him instead. She hesitated, then reached back, her hands finding their now familiar place on his waist. She leaned back slightly, her head resting against his shoulder. His heart was a steady, reassuring beat against her ear. She could feel the peaceful rhythm of the horse's hooves on the wooden planks, a slow, steady cadence that seemed to match the quiet beating of her own heart. For the first time in a long time, Eliza Mourne felt completely, utterly safe. As they stood by the corral afterwards, a comfortable silence settled between them. "When the marshal comes," Cole said, breaking the quiet, "we need to be ready. The moment he sees the proof, We open the main gate at Red Gap. Let the whole valley see the water flow. Let them see what Blackburn stole." They made their plan. Two conspirators united by a shared purpose. But they were not alone in their fight. One night, as Eliza was banking the fire at the worksite, she saw a flicker of movement in the brush on the far side of the Hart property. It was a man on foot, keeping to the shadows. It was Pike. He was watching them, a predator circling its prey. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. The next day, she took a length of thin wire and a handful of small bells she bought from Mr. Gable's store. She strung them between the fence posts on the side of the ranch nearest the road, a low, nearly invisible line hidden in the tall grass. It was a simple, fragile alarm, but it was something. It was a sign that they would not be caught unaware. The seventh day brought a new enemy, not a man, but the sky itself. The wind shifted, and a dark, roiling wall of red dust swept in from the plains. It was a dry storm, a storm of grit and fury. It blotted out the sun, turning midday into a hellish twilight. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at clothes and tents. The sand was like 1,000 tiny needles, stinging any exposed skin, finding its way into their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. Work stopped. The townspeople huddled in whatever shelter they could find, their faces covered with bandanas. The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault that frayed nerves and crushed spirits. When it finally passed, it left behind a world coated in a thick blanket of red dust. Their half-dug ditch was filled in, days of back-breaking labor erased in a single afternoon. A wave of despair washed over the small community. Men threw down their shovels in disgust. The Miller brothers began hitching up their mule, their faces grim masks of defeat. "It's no use," one of them said, his voice raspy with dust and despair. "The land itself is against us." Cole stood watching them, his shoulders slumped. He looked at the ruined ditch, at the defeated faces of his neighbors, at the vast, indifferent sky. For the first time, he felt the true weight of their struggle, and it felt like a mountain he could not move. The scar on his side ached, a phantom pain of past failures. He had been too late then, and he would be too late now. He had led these people on, given them a false hope, and now the land itself had mocked their efforts. He felt a hand on his chest, a small, warm pressure through the dusty fabric of his shirt. It was Eliza. She stood before him, her face smudged with dirt, her hair wild, but her eyes were clear and fiercely alive. She looked at the defeat in his face, and she understood. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread against the wind's dying moan. Her hand pressed a little harder against his chest, over his heart. "Let your heart remember this rhythm." He looked down at her, at the unwavering strength in her eyes. He felt the warmth of her hand, a small point of life against the vast emptiness of his despair. He felt the steady, powerful beat of his own heart under her palm. It was the rhythm of the work, the rhythm of the horse's hooves on the bridge, the rhythm of a man who did not quit. He took a deep breath, the dusty air filling his lungs. He looked at her, and then past her, at the ruined ditch. His shoulders straightened. He reached up and placed his own hand over hers, holding it there against his chest. He gave a single, slow nod. They worked through the 8th day and into the 9th night, a smaller but more determined group. They worked by lantern light, their movements slow and heavy with exhaustion, but they did not stop. And on the 9th night, as the moon rose over the silent valley, a man at the far end of the new ditch let out a soft cry. "Cole, Eliza." They rushed to his side. There, at the bottom of the channel they had dug and redug, was a dark patch. It was more than damp. As they watched, a tiny bead of water pushed its way up through the parched earth. Then another, and another. A small puddle began to form, reflecting the lantern light like a fallen star. It was not a flood. It was not even a trickle. But it was water, the clean, sweet smell of wet earth, a scent they had almost forgotten, rose up to meet them. It was the smell of hope, seeping back into their world, one precious drop at a time. The 10th day dawned clear and mercilessly bright, as if the sky itself were a witness, refusing to hide anything in shadow. A man had arrived on the morning stagecoach, a man who was not from Dry Willow. He was tall and lean, with a quiet authority that required no uniform, though the badge pinned to his vest, a territorial marshal's star, gleamed in the sun. His name was Thompson, and he had come for the truth. The trial was not held in the church this time. It was held in the Lion's Den, the Blackburn Bank. The townspeople, emboldened by 10 days of shared labor and a returning trickle of hope, crowded inside. They filled the lobby, their dusty boots silent on the polished floor, their faces a tense, watchful sea. They stood with a proprietary stillness, as if reclaiming the space that had held them in its financial grip for so long. Marshal Thompson stood behind the teller's counter, which served as a makeshift judge's bench. Before him, on the polished wood, lay the collection of evidence. Cole and Eliza stood on one side. Blackburn stood on the other, Pike a half-step behind him, looking pale and shrunken. "Mr. Hart," the marshal said, his voice calm and even. "Begin." Cole stepped forward. He did not speak of conspiracies or make accusations. He simply presented the facts, his voice a low, steady rumble. He placed the heavy padlock and chain on the counter. This was on Deputy Pike's belt. It matches the lock on the Red Gap sluice gate. He then placed the iron key beside it. This fell from the belt of a man hired to poison the ditch. The initial matches the deputy's name. He laid out the splintered piece of wood. This was used to help dam the creek. The brand matches the barrels in Mr. Blackburn's storeroom. Finally, he unfurled the rough charcoal map they had drawn, pointing to the 3 choke points. The water was stopped here, and here, all on the border of Mr. Blackburn's land, all cutting off water to his neighbors. He stepped back. The evidence lay on the counter, a silent, damning narrative. Marshal Thompson then looked to Eliza. "Miss Moaned." Eliza stepped forward, holding a small, leather-bound notebook, the kind used for keeping household accounts. "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I am a cook. I work with recipes, with measurements, with time. For the past month, I have kept a log." She opened the book. "Every day. I noted the time the water flow in the community ditch began to weaken. At 5 o'clock on the 15th, at 4:30 on the 18th, at 4 o'clock on the 22nd. She traced the entries with her finger. The water level always dropped in the late afternoon, when men were leaving their work. It always dropped most significantly on the days immediately following a visit Deputy Pike made to the bank. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Her simple, meticulous record-keeping was a woman's weapon, and it was devastatingly effective. The marshal's gaze settled on Pike, and it was as hard and unyielding as granite. "Deputy, you have a lot to answer for." Pike began to bluster, his face sweating. "It's lies. A conspiracy to ruin me, is it?" Thompson's voice was dangerously quiet. He turned his attention to 2 men standing near the back of the crowd, the 2 hired hands from the canyon, now flanked by 2 of the blacksmith's largest sons. "You 2, step forward." The men were shoved forward, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. Thompson picked up the burned scrap of burlap with the Blackburn stencil. "You were paid to dump this into the town's water supply. You were paid by Deputy Pike. The only question is, who paid him?" One of the men, a drifter named Silas, looked from the marshal's cold eyes to Blackburn's impassive face. He saw no help there. He saw only a rich man ready to cut him loose. He made his choice. He did. Silas spat, pointing a trembling finger not at Pike, but directly at the banker, Blackburn. "He paid Pike, and Pike paid us. Said it was just to conserve some water for his own spread. Said no one would get hurt." The confession fell into the silent room, and the final link in the chain snapped shut. But Asa Blackburn did not flinch. He did not rage. He smiled. It was the most terrifying expression they had ever seen on his face. It was the smile of a man who held a final, unbeatable card. "An impressive performance," he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "You have the word of a common drifter, a disgraced deputy, and a lovelorn cowboy. It's all smoke and whispers." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, handling it with the reverence a priest would give a sacred text. "But I have a contract." He unfolded it and laid it on the counter, smoothing it with his palm. It was a bill of sale, written in a clerk's elegant hand on fine, heavy paper. This is an agreement for the sale of the Hart Ranch. To me, at a very reasonable price. Given the unfortunate circumstances of the drought, an agreement made a week ago. He tapped a signature at the bottom of the page, signed by Cole Hart himself. A collective gasp went through the room. Cole stared at the paper, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. That's a lie. I never signed that. That's a forgery. Blackburn chuckled. Your word against your own signature, I wonder who the marshal will believe. He had played his final, brilliant, and utterly corrupt card. He was using the law to destroy the law. Cole was speechless, his fists clenched, his mind reeling. But Eliza was not. She stepped forward again, her eyes fixed on the signature. She was a seamstress. She spent her life studying the steady, confident lines of a well-made stitch, the weak, wavering line of a poorly made one. "Marshal," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "May I see that?" Thompson slid the document toward her. She leaned over it, her eyes narrowed, studying the loops and lines of the signature. "Mr. Hart," she said, without looking up. "When did you last register your herd for vaccination against blackleg?" The question was so strange, so out of place, that it momentarily confused everyone. Cole stared at her. "In the spring, with the postal clerk, Mr. Abernathy." Why, Eliza looked up from the document, and her eyes were shining with a fierce, triumphant light. She looked directly at Blackburn, because Mr. Blackburn, a man who spends his days roping cattle and mending fences, has a strong hand. His signature is hard and clear, like a brand. This, she tapped the signature on the fraudulent contract, is the signature of a man trying to copy something. The lines are hesitant. They tremble. It is the signature of a liar, not a rancher. Blackburn's smile faltered for the first time. "That's absurd. You can't prove that." "Oh, I think I can," Eliza said, her voice ringing with confidence. She turned to the marshal. "The United States Post Office keeps meticulous records. Mr. Hart's signature will be in the official territorial registry for cattle vaccinations, dated and witnessed. I suggest you send a man to get it. Compare that signature to this one." The trap was sprung. It was a brilliant, simple move, born of a woman's knowledge of her own small world. Blackburn, in his arrogance, had thought only of land and money. He had never considered the mundane, official paperwork of a cowboy's life. Marshal Thompson looked at Eliza, and a slow look of profound respect dawned on his face. He nodded to one of the men at the door. "Go, get the registry from the post office. Now." The 10 minutes that followed were the longest in the history of Dry Willow. The silence in the bank was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. Blackburn stood frozen, the color draining from his face. Pike looked like a man who was already a ghost. The man returned, carrying a heavy leather-bound ledger. He opened it and placed it on the counter beside the fraudulent contract. The marshal leaned over, comparing the two signatures. The one in the ledger was bold, confident, etched with the pressure of a strong hand. The one on the contract was a pale, shaky imitation. Thompson straightened up. He looked at Blackburn, and his voice was cold iron. "Asa Blackburn, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft of water rights." It was as if a dam had burst inside the bank. The townspeople erupted. They didn't cheer. They roared. Men slammed their hands on the teller counter. They stomped their feet on the wooden floor. A sound like a sudden, violent thunderstorm. A sound like cleansing rain. Someone in the back, one of the ranchers who had almost lost everything, began to weep, not with sorrow, but with a raw, overwhelming relief. In the midst of the chaos, Thompson walked around the counter. He took the silver star from Pike's vest and dropped it on the floor with a dull clink. Then he produced a pair of handcuffs and snapped them onto Asa Blackburn's wrists. The sharp, metallic click was the final sound of a reign of terror ending. Cole stood stunned, watching the scene unfold. The anger, the fear, the tension of the past 10 days seemed to drain out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and profoundly tired. He turned and looked for Eliza. She was standing a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her. She was watching him. She offered him a small, weary smile. It was not a smile of triumph, not of gloating victory. It was a smile of pure, unburdened relief. It was the smile of someone who had faced the abyss and had not been consumed. He returned the smile, and in that silent, shared glance, they acknowledged everything they had endured and everything they had become. And then, another sound began, distant at first, then growing louder, clearer, rolling over the town. It was the church bell, but it wasn't the frantic, urgent clang of an alarm. It was a slow, steady, joyous peal. The Reverend was ringing it, not to warn of danger, but to announce a birth. Someone had opened the sluice gate. The water was flowing. It was a baptism, washing away the dust and the debt and the fear. It was the sound of dry willow, being born again. The sunset was not an ending, but a benediction. It poured over the valley in slow, thick waves of liquid gold, catching the dust motes in the air and turning them into a shimmering haze. The light was the color of warm honey, and it seemed to sweeten the very air, washing away the bitter taste of the past 10 days. Down in the newly dug channel, the water ran full and deep, its surface reflecting the bruised purple and soft orange of the sky. It made a sound the valley had almost forgotten, a gentle, constant murmur, the sound of life itself, and along its banks, the herd of heart cattle stood shoulder to shoulder. They lowered their great heads to the water, their movements slow and reverent. They drank, their long, deep pulls undisturbed by fear or desperation. They looked, in the dying light, as if they were praying, giving thanks to the earth that had finally, mercifully, relented. From the small cabin, a single thread of wood smoke curled into the still evening air. The smell of it, clean and sharp, mingled with the new, rich scent of damp earth and crushed grass, a perfume of renewal. As twilight settled, a figure could be seen walking from the direction of the town, a lantern swinging gently in one hand, its light a small, friendly star against the growing darkness. It was Eliza Moaned. She carried a heavy cast-iron pot, its contents sending up a warm, savory steam that trailed behind her like a promise. Cole saw her coming from the porch steps, where he had been sitting, simply watching the water flow. He rose as she approached, his body still aching with the deep, satisfying weariness of hard-won labor. She stopped at the bottom of the 3 short steps, her face illuminated by the lantern she carried and the soft light spilling from the cabin's open door. "I thought you and your brother might be hungry," she said, her voice quiet. The pot was clearly heavy, but she held it as if it were a precious offering. "We are," Cole answered, his own voice a low rumble. He came down the steps and took the pot from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The iron was warm, a living heat. "You didn't have to do this, Eliza." "I know," she said simply. "I wanted to." He carried the stew inside, placing it on the small wooden table. The cabin was spare and clean, containing only what a man needed to live: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace. Eliza followed him in, placing her lantern beside the stew. The combined light filled the small space with a warm, flickering glow. Ben, his younger brother, offered her a tired but grateful smile from his bunk before turning over, the exhaustion of the day finally claiming him. Cole and Eliza ate at the table, the silence between them comfortable, filled only by the quiet sounds of their meal and the crackle of the fire. The stew was rich with beef and potatoes and herbs, a taste of comfort and civilization after days of dust and desperation. When they were finished, Cole took their empty bowls to a wash basin. He dried his hands on a piece of toweling, then paused. He reached into the back pocket of his worn trousers and pulled something out. He unfolded it carefully. It was a small square of faded red cloth, his handkerchief, the one she had returned to him at the well, the one he had draped over her shoulders under the bridge. But it was different now. He had washed it. The red dust of their struggles was gone, scrubbed away by a careful hand. The fabric was clean, and he had folded it into a perfect, neat square. He held it out to her. It was not a gift, not a payment, but a return. A symbol, cleaned and made whole again, just as the valley was being made whole. She looked at it, then up at his face, and her eyes were luminous in the firelight. She didn't take it. Instead, they walked back out onto the small wooden porch. The sky was now a deep, velvety black, and the first stars were beginning to appear, sharp and brilliant in the clear, dry air. A cool night breeze drifted up from the newly flowing creek, carrying the scent of life. They stood side by side, not speaking, simply absorbing the profound peace of the moment. Cole leaned against a porch post, and the movement was so slight, so natural, that Eliza almost didn't notice when he reached out and placed his hand gently on the small of her back. It was not a romantic advance, not a gesture of ownership. It was a simple, grounding touch, a touch that said, "We are here. We survived." She leaned into his touch almost imperceptibly, a silent acceptance. She closed her eyes, and all the moments of the past weeks came rushing back: the terror of the runaway wagon, the desperation at the well, the fear in the cooking tent, the cold and the mud under the bridge. In every one of those moments, his strength had been her anchor. Now, in the quiet aftermath, his touch was her harbor. "Don't stop," she whispered, the words so soft they were almost carried away by the breeze. It was their phrase, the one born of terror and survival. But she was not falling. She was not trapped. She looked at him, and her meaning was clear in the depths of her eyes. "Don't stop being here. Don't stop being by my side." Cole understood. He looked down at her, at the woman who had faced down wagons and whispers and bankers, who had wielded a notebook and a lantern like weapons, who had placed her hand on his heart and told him to remember its rhythm. "I will hold," he answered, his voice a low, rough vow in the darkness. He took her hand, his large, work-hardened fingers closing gently around hers. "Not just your hand. I'll hold the water, the land, and all the days to come." It was a promise of everything he had to give. Not riches, not an easy life, but the steadfast, unyielding loyalty of his heart. She stepped closer, into the space that had always seemed to be waiting for her, and he wrapped his arms around her. They held each other on the worn wooden steps of the porch. It was an embrace without urgency, without noise. It was the quiet, powerful coming together of two solitary streams that had fought their way through dry, cracked earth and had finally found their way to each other, merging into a current that was stronger and deeper than either had been alone. It was the feeling of a heart finding its home. Above them, the stars blazed in the infinite sky. Inside the small cabin, the fire burned low, casting a warm glow on the two simple wooden chairs at the table. One was pulled close to the hearth, as if for warmth. The other was right beside it, their backs nearly touching, no longer separated by an empty space of loneliness and longing. Tomorrow would come. The sun would rise and the dust would stir. There would be debts to manage, a herd to tend, a life to rebuild from the ground up. The world would not stop being hard. But tonight, they were not afraid. They had found their rhythm, the one their hearts could remember, the one that would guide them through all the days to come. The cowboy had touched her heart, and he kept holding. He did not promise her wealth, nor a life without hardship. He promised only that he would not let go. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting that hype button. It truly makes a world of difference.